Queremos que esta sessão marcará uma nova e decisiva fase na liquidação final do colonialismo português na África.
Samora Moises Machel. Machel was a Mozambican military commander and political leader and freedom fighter. He delivered the country to independence in 1975 and became its first president. Machel was also socialist in the tradition of Marxism. Machel was born on September 29, 1933 north of Maputo, the capital city of Mozambique. Machel grew up in this farming village and attended Mission Elementary School. In 1942, he was sent to school in Gaza province. The school was run by Catholic missionaries who educated the children in Portuguese language and culture. Although having completed the 4th grade, Machel never completed his secondary education. In the beginning of 1954, Machel started to study nursing in Maputo. After a while he became unable to complete formal training at the hospital in Maputo. He got a job working as an aide in the same hospital and earned enough to continue his education at night school. He worked at the hospital until he left the country to join the Mozambican nationalist struggle in Tanzania, where he protested against the fact that black nurses were paid less than whites doing the same job. Machel decided to leave the city. He slipped across the border and made his way to join Frelimo in Dar es Salaam. In Dar es Salaam, Machel volunteered for military service and was one of the second group of Frelimo guerrillas sent for training in Algeria. After he back to Tanzania, he was put in charge of Frelimo's own training camp at Kongwa on September 25, 1964 after Frelimo launched the Independence War. Machel soon became a key commander, making his name in particular in the grueling conditions of the eastern area. He rapidly rose up the ranks of the guerrilla army and became the head of the army after the death of its first commander in October 1966. In 1970 Machel became head of Frelimo. Following the assassination of Mondlane the year before, Machel identified himself with Marxism, Leninism, and under his leadership these positions became central to Frelimo, which evolved from a broad front into a more Marxist party. On April 25, 1974, Portuguese officers overthrew the government in Lisbon, the capital city of Portugal, tired of fighting 3 unwinnable wars in Africa, which signaled the end of Portuguese colonial rule in Africa. Mozambique attained its independence the following year with Machel as the first president. Frelimo was constitutionally the leading force in Mozambican society, and the president of Frelimo would automatically be president of Mozambique. On June 25, 1975, Machel proclaimed the total and complete independence of Mozambique and its constitution into the People's Republic of Mozambique. This, he said, would be a state of people's democracy, in which, under the leadership of the Worker-Peasant Alliance, all patriotic strata commit themselves to the destruction of the sequels of colonialism and to annihilate the system of exploitation of men by men. Machel's government moved quickly to bring key areas under state control. All land was nationalized. Individuals and institutions could not hold land, but leased it from the state. On July 24, 1975, just a month after independence, all health and education institutions were nationalized. National health and education services were set up, and all private schools and clinics were abolished. The Catholic Church immediately lost the privileged position it had held in these areas. On February 3, 1976, the government nationalized all rented housing. Private ownership of houses was not banned. Anyone, Mozambican or foreign, could own a house for their own use, but building private property for rent was forbidden. This changed the face of Mozambican cities. Black Mozambicans moved from the suburbs into blocks in the center of the cities, occupying houses and flats, once owned by Portuguese landlords, and many of which had now been abandoned. In February 1977, at its third Congress, Frelimo declared that it was now a Marxist-Leninist party, dedicated to the building of socialism, based on the Worker-Peasant Alliance. The Congress re-elected Machel as president of Frelimo, and thus automatically as president of the Republic. Frelimo was reorganized into cellulose branches throughout the county. The party was to be a Leninist vanguard, and state institutions, at whatever level, were to be subordinate to the party. In 1978 elections were held. Since this was a one-party state, there was no organized opposition. Instead, candidates were presented by Frelimo at meetings, and were sometimes rejected when people complained of offenses ranging from wife-beating and drunkenness to acting as an informer for the PIDE during the colonial government. Frelimo faced a hostile environment, with the white minority governments of Ian Smith's Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa on Mozambique's borders. In March 1976, Machel's government implemented United Nations sanctions against the Smith government and closed the borders with Rhodesia. In retaliation, Smith's Central Intelligence Organization, CIO, recruited dissatisfied Mozambicans and former Portuguese settlers and helped set up an anti-Frelimo movement. Initially this, Mozambique National Resistance, operated as an auxiliary branch of the Rhodesian Armed Forces. Frelimo had long-standing links with Zimbabwean nationalist movements. Even during the Independence War, guerrillas of ZANLA, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, the armed wing of ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union, were able to operate from Frelimo-held areas in Tet Province into northern areas of Rhodesia. After the implementation of the UN sanctions against the Rhodesian government, the entire length of the border was now available for nationalist incursions into Rhodesia. ZANU leader Robert Mugabe, released from Salisbury prison, Rhodesia in 1974, made his way into Mozambique the following year. Initially, Machel was suspicious of the apparent coup within ZANU that had brought Mugabe to power, and he was effectively rusticated to the central city of Quelimane, where he taught English. Tired of the divisions within Zimbabwean nationalism, Machel sponsored an alternative to both ZANU and its rival ZOPU. This was the Zimbabwean People's Army, ZIPA, which took credit for many operations in eastern Zimbabwe, and was enthusiastically promoted by the Mozambican media. But it soon turned out that the dominant force within ZIPA were ZANLA guerrillas who had never abandoned their loyalty to ZANU and to Mugabe. Machel accepted the reality that the people doing most of the fighting in Zimbabwe were ZANLA. To bring the war to a successful conclusion, Machel embarked on a dual strategy, military and diplomatic. He sent Mozambican units into Zimbabwe to fight alongside ZANU guerrillas, while also insisting that the new British Conservative government, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, should resume its responsibilities as the colonial power. Machel, with his own intelligence teams on the ground, was certain that ZANU would win any fair election. Indeed, ZANU won 57 of the 80 seats reserved for black Zimbabweans, while the second nationalist movement, ZOPU, won 20. Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front took the 20 seats, which Mugabe had reluctantly agreed to allocate to the whites. Machel was fully aware of the dangerous ethnic divisions in Zimbabwe, with ZANU drawing most of its support from the Shona majority, and ZOPU from the minority Ndebele people. On his first state visit to Zimbabwe, in 1980, Machel gave a warning: to ensure national unity, there must be no Shonas in Zimbabwe. there must be no Nebalese in Zimbabwe, there must be Zimbabweans. Some people are proud of their tribalism. But we call tribalists reactionary agents of the enemy. During the 1980s, the South African government took an increasingly hostile attitude to the frontline states. Mozambique, in particular, was accused of harboring military bases of the African National Congress. In 1977, a rebel army known as Renamo launched a rebellion backed by Rhodesia, plunging the country into civil war. Following the collapse of Smith's government, the rebel force began to receive backing from South Africa. At the Frelimo Fourth Congress, in April 1983, Frelimo reaffirmed its commitment to Marxism, but admitted economic mistakes, particularly in agriculture. Machel was re-elected president of Frelimo. But the deteriorating military and economic situation drove Frelimo to give the apartheid government what it said it wanted, a non-aggression pact. On March 16, 1984, on a railway carriage in the non-man's land between South Africa and Mozambique, Machel and South African President P.W. Botha signed the Nkomati Accord on non-aggression and good neighborliness. The deal expressed in the agreement was extremely simple: South Africa would drop its support for Renamo, in exchange for Mozambique dropping support for the ANC. On October 1986, Machel attended a summit in Mbola, Zambia, called to put pressure on Zairian dictator Maputo Sisi over his support for the Angolan opposition movement UNITA. The strategy of the front-line states was to move against Maputo and Bonda in an attempt to end their support for UNITA and Renamo, who they regarded as South African surrogates. Although the Zambian authorities involved Machel to stay in Mbola overnight, he insisted on returning to Maputo. He had a meeting scheduled for the following morning at which he intended to reshuffle the leadership of the armed forces. Machel thus overrode the instruction from the Security Ministry that the president should not travel at night, with fatal consequences. The plane never reached Maputo. That night it crashed into a hillside at Musini, just inside South Africa. Machel and 33 others died, and 9 people sitting at the back of the plane survived.